Karl Rove is one of the most astute observers of the American political scene today. His weekly column for the Wall Street Journal is a must-read, and of course he started his career getting George W. Bush elected first governor of Texas and then president of the United States. Karl, history has played an important part in your life. Who taught you history?
Well, I'd have to say first my father, who gave me the first book I can ever remember reading called Great Moments in History. I still have it. And it's a rather childish book. Each page has a crude drawing of the event in question, takes up about 2/3 of the page, and then the bottom third is a description of the event. And I can remember reading it and just being enchanted by everything. And so I think it was my father first. He later gave me an almanac of world history. I still got that too. And then when I was 8 years old and the centennial of the Civil War was coming up, he gave me the American Heritage book on the Civil War, which featured these fantastic maps, which were three-dimensional maps in which they had drawings of the little soldiers and the artillery and the cavalry charging. And I still have that one too, but I've always had an interest as a result in history. And I'd say the second person who taught me history was a high school teacher named Eldon Tolman, who was very formal, never called you by your first name, very demanding, very tough. And as a result, I thoroughly enjoyed his classes.
And in your history book about the McKinley era, you very much, as the subtitle, state that it has lessons to teach us even today, even though 1896 is now a long, long way off. Tell us what those are.
Well, first of all, 1896 is studied by political scientists as one of the 5 great realigning elections in American history. These are elections that political scientists believe basically altered the course of politics. America was politically one way before the election, and then for a significant period of time after the election, something different. First such election is 1800, the emergence of the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. 1828, the Jacksonians and the creation of the modern Democratic Party. 1860, the emergence of the Republicans with Abraham Lincoln. 1896, with the creation of a durable Republican majority that brought to an end the chaos of the Gilded Age politics of America. And then 1932, in the creation of the New Deal coalition. And what's interesting to me is that America in 1896 sort of looks like America today. Our politics back then was bitter, divisive, angry. Both parties had their difficulties. The Democratic Party was splintering between the historically economically conservative Gold Democrats and a populist movement based around the attempt to achieve bimetallism or a silver currency. And the Republicans were facing a problem that there just weren't enough in a rapidly demographically changing America. There just weren't enough Northern Protestants and Black Republicans in the South to create a majority that could win the presidency and control the Congress. And we had 25 years of divided, a bitter government, 2 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate, 20 years of divided government, and 5 presidential elections in a row in which no one gets a majority of the vote. Everybody is at 50% or at less than 50%. So my point is that in that election, somebody created a majority that lasted for the next 3 decades. And there are lessons in there on how and what parties need to do in order to achieve.
He also brought prosperity to America. He won the Spanish-American War. For some reason, I've never really understood, you're not an imperialist power, even though you won Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba. And he was somebody who brought in protective tariffs. I mean, this is a really major sort of game-changing politician. Is the reason we're not in England, for example, taught about him because he was only in office for 4 years?
Well, actually close to 5, but he's overshadowed by a successor whom he rescued from political oblivion. I actually stumbled into McKinley because I was trying to understand how Theodore Roosevelt resurrected his political career. He'd run for mayor of New York, came in third. He had gotten on the wrong side of the boss of the Republican Party of New York, the easy boss, former Senator Thomas Collier Platt. He had backed the wrong guy for president in 1896. He thought he could resurrect his career by supporting the Speaker of the House, the front runner Thomas Brackett Reed, and ride his coattails into a job in Washington. He does not think much of McKinley. He writes his sister a letter right after the convention saying, McKinley is a good man, but weak, and I worry about him in a moment of crisis for our country. And yet somehow or another, he gets resurrected from political oblivion by this very, it turns out, astute politician in the form of William McKinley, who wants to modernize his party. And while he tells one of Roosevelt's backers that he thinks he's too pugnacious, he nonetheless resurrects him from obscurity, gives him the post of the Assistant Secretary of Navy. Otherwise, we would probably have never heard of him again, except as an interesting character on the edges of American politics.
Amazing. Tell us about William Jennings Bryan. He seems a fascinating figure, but again, not really understood on this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, no, he is a very interesting figure because he is basically a creature created by will. As we approach the 1896 election, the Democratic Party is splitting apart. The incumbent president is a gold man who has, the country has been plunged into a deep depression in 1894. The Republicans take the Congress with huge numbers. He's basically, Cleveland is basically eviscerated.
And by, sorry, let me just butt in, sorry, by gold man, you mean somebody who believes in keeping the United States on the gold standard, not going down the bimetalist route.
Right. So, and what's interesting, we were not officially on the gold standard. We were not on the gold standard officially until 1900. There were not, if there had been a vote in the 1870s or 80s, or even the 90s until 1896, that would not have been able to pass. In fact, there was an attempt to sort of get the sentiment of the Congress in 1873 and again in 1874, and there was not a majority for the official adoption of the gold standard. But we were on a quasi gold standard because we'd sort of devalued silver, except for minor coinage. And but anyway, the Democratic Party is being split badly, and the populists who rally around the issue of silver are led by a congressman from Missouri, Richard Park Bland. And Bland has been fighting this cause since the early 1870s. One of the great things about this era in American politics I find really amusing is everybody has a nickname. Everybody's got a cool nickname. And Richard Park Bland's nickname is Silver Dick, which when I read it in the New York Times for the first time, I said it must have meant something different back then. But anyway, he has led this fight, and he is considered the front runner for the Democratic nomination. And but he, back then you didn't really contest in the way that we contest today. McKinley is the first man who really contests in a different way for the nomination of his party. But Bland sits there waiting in Lebanon, Missouri, for the Democrats to meet. Well, what happens is they show up in their convention, and by total accident, by total and complete, in fact, a series of 6 different or 7 different accidents, this obscure 2-term congressman from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan, who has not run for re-election in 1894, knowing that he would be defeated in that year. So he's not even in Congress, but because he's been a devout follower of the Silver Movement, he is given a role in the convention. But it's complete by accident. I mean, he happens to be in the right place, or better yet, he happens to be in the wrong place at the right time, so that various assignments are not given to him. And finally, they said, well, he's been a good soldier, and we couldn't make him the temporary chairman of the convention. We couldn't put him chairman of the platform committee. So let's give him a chance to speak on the floor for 15 minutes during a debate on the plank. The New York Democrats are attempting to pass a gold plank. They know they're going to be badly beaten, but they feel they need to make the fight. And so they give this guy 15 minutes. The night before, he has dinner with his wife and a great friend of his, who's his sort of Texas leader, who is incidentally the superintendent of the state school for the insane, which I've always thought is sort of a nice touch. But they're having dinner sitting in downtown Chicago, and people are coming up and down the street chanting Bland's name, and then his principal opponent, who's a former Republican, now turned Democrat governor of Iowa. And they're chanting the names of these two candidates. And with great confidence, Brian turns to his wife and his friend and says, they don't know it yet, but tomorrow they'll be chanting my name. And his friend thinks he's insane. And but he thought he would. In fact, literally, he has been that afternoon, the editor of the Denver Post has run into Brian and said to him, who do you think is going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party? And he says, well, I'm going to be. And literally Patterson, the editor, the publisher, thinks that this guy is insane. This guy's a lunatic. But he gets up and in the middle of this debate, just the last accident happens just before he takes to the stage. And that accident is that there is a gold Democrat from Wisconsin who's droning on, or excuse me, a silver Democrat who's droning on, and a gold Democrat from Massachusetts says, I need to have more time to speak. He's using up our time. So we need to lengthen the debate here. And I need to have 15 minutes more. And so they say, okay, fine. So Brian is now given a 30-minute speech, literally moments before he stands up to speak. And he stands up to speak. The crowd of 20,000 people in the arena is sort of diffident. They've been listening to this long debate. They don't know who this guy is, but he begins and delivers a famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech. And it electrifies the audience. The crowd is, first of all, begins to still as they listen to him. Then they begin to, you can just feel the tension in the air. Yet Josephus Daniels, who's the editor of a newspaper in North Carolina, writes, it was sitting in the rafters. And when he moves into the main part of the speech, and literally people are on the edge of their seat. And then he goes into a litany about how, the man who owns the shop at the corner in rural is as important as the merchant in the big city, and the man who goes into the bowels of the earth to dig out the ore is just as important as the gold trader on Wall Street. And the crowd is going nuts. So he finishes the speech with his famous peroration, you shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold, literally with his hands extended as if he's Christ himself. He literally has dappled his fingers down his forehead to indicate the blood flowing from the cross, from being the crown of thorns, and ends with his hands outreached. It's dead silent. He thinks that he has failed. He drops his hands to the side, and 20,000 people go mad.
How an extraordinary moment. And was this in the era before electrified voice? I mean, could you...
Absolutely.
So he had to do it, just speak to 20,000 people with the strength of his lungs.
With the strength of his voice.
Without any amplification.
And he had a great voice too. But he had practiced this speech. He'd been out in the countryside giving speeches on behalf of silver. So some of this stuff appears earlier. The most famous line he'd actually delivered in Congress a couple of years before to absolutely no response at all. But he made his living in part by being a paid speaker. And a couple of days before, he'd been at a paid speech in Crete, Nebraska, in the middle of nowhere, and had used the line and had a positive response. So he sort of made a mental note, maybe I ought to use that if I get a chance to speak at the convention.
And how did McKinley beat him?
Well, McKinley started off not beating him. He took him for granted and thought, oh, this is a passing fancy. But the country was mad for silver, and mad for, they wanted an answer to the restoration of prosperity. How are we going to get there? And one guy was talking about that in terms that they got, Brian, and who did an unusual thing. Rather than staying at home, he went on the campaign trail. He eventually traveled 18,000 miles by train. Until the October, he's traveling mostly by himself, getting on buying a ticket at the station, wiring ahead so people know he's coming. But McKinley in September is awakened to the fact that he's losing. Back then they didn't have polls, they canvassed. That is to say, they literally would knock on everybody's door and ask who you were for. And the canvasses coming out of the Midwest, the Republican heartland, are terrible. A quarter of the Republicans in Iowa are defecting. The party's facing enormous defeat. What happens is two guys show up. I think this is the argument I make in the book. Two guys show up and start to talk about the issue of gold in an entirely different way. McKinley is now starting to speak as delegations come to greet him in his home in Canton, Ohio. And he's talking about gold as you would talk about, we need to have a currency that is attractive to the people who are investing in our company, the Brits on Lombard Street, the French, the Germans. We need to have a gold currency to draw their investment in. And he's talking about in terms like what a business person would. But then two people show up, One of them is the former mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania, who's the head of former president of the largest labor union in America. And he begins to talk about what a silver currency would do to the value of a working man's pay. That silver is worth half of what gold is. So if he gets paid $15 in gold, he's got $15 worth of purchasing power. If he gets paid $15 in silver, he's got $7.50. And he puts it in the terms that ordinary people, working men and working women. The other guy is Roosevelt, who starts to make talks around New York in which he shows up with 2 loaves of bread. This is a full loaf of bread that a gold dollar will allow the working man to buy. Here's half a loaf, which is what he'll get in silver. And suddenly you start to see in the remarks of McKinley in these speeches as people come forward to see him in Canton, and more importantly, in all of the materials that start to come out of gigantic flood of material that starts to come out of the McKinley headquarters in Chicago, you start seeing an emphasis on what sound money means to the working man, the working woman, to the farmer, to the small town merchant, and to the person who has met their responsibilities and paid their debts. And suddenly the tone of the campaign changes. And ultimately, that's what wins the election for him.
And is that what you mean when you say in your subtitle of your book that it has lessons for the present day, the idea that sound money is essential to a political party?
Well, I think that is true, but there are a number of lessons. One is you need to have a positive and optimistic vision that literally connects you with the voters. And that was important. He modernized the Republican Party, which before McKinley was an Anglo-Saxon Protestant party in the North. And suddenly he starts inviting and seeing people come to Canton. It's like the Greek sponge fishermen of Providence, Rhode Island show up, and the Croatian miners from Pennsylvania show up. And he literally, there's the largest group in America, organized group in America is the American Protective Association, which is anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. And he had taken them on as governor. They announced in the spring of 1896 that he is the only Republican candidate for president who's unacceptable to them. And he takes them on face on and beats them. He first beats them in the press, and then he beats them at the convention in order to sort of show that the Republican Party is different. He has a rabbi give the first benediction and a Catholic priest give a prayer at another one and another session of the convention. So he modernizes the Republican Party and says to the immigrants who are flooding into America at this point that the party of prosperity and upward movement for you is the Republican Party. He is the first candidate, Republican or Democrat, to openly meet with Black voters and ask for their support. As he runs for the nomination, he's the first person to ever do that. Meets with them in 1895, and it's sort of shocking. Here's the guy who thinks he's going to run for president, and he speaks to Black voters in first Florida and then in Georgia. So he's got he runs the first modern political campaign. And his campaign is not run as we historically think by Mark Hanna, who is his good friend from Cleveland and a wealthy shipping magnate. The campaign is actually run by a 32-year-old punk. A kid from Cincinnati who went to law school and then went out to the West to make his living and lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he officed in the same small office building as another young lawyer, 4 years older than him, William Jennings Bryan. And the two men often had lunch together at a local diner with the head of the ROTC program at the University of Nebraska, John J. Pershing, Black Jack Pershing.
Wow.
Wow. Everybody shows up in this story, but there are lots of lessons to be drawn. But the campaign in retrospect was the first modern presidential campaign, and the coalition that he created in that election dominates American politics until 1932.
And you mentioned 1932 earlier. Surely there must be another in the 90 years or so that we've had since 1932. Surely the moment at which Southerners start voting Republican in Ronald Reagan's time. Isn't that just as big a sea change moment as any of the five you mentioned at the beginning of this?
Yeah, I think so. And political scientists will argue over it, but I'm very much of the school that between 1972 and 1980, there's a realignment of American politics that takes place. It's only it's impeded by the nomination of a Southern Democrat and Jimmy Carter, but it's happening, and it lasted for 30 years as well. The only way the Democrats could break it is similar to how the Democrats broke the McKinley coalition on a presidential level when Roosevelt himself runs for election in 1912 as an independent, and the Democrats win in a three-way race. Same thing happens in 1992.
Famously, you had a reading competition with George W. Bush, W. Bush 43. Tell us about that, because that was history and biography, wasn't it? That you
mostly what happened is at Christmas time of 2004, I was in Washington, and the president was at his ranch in Crawford. And we would typically talk when he was out of Washington, we typically talk on Sunday evening, or, before he came back, just to sort of catch up. So he called me, and he was not going to come back the next day. He was coming back a few days later, but he called that weekend, and we had our conversation on things of import to the office. But then he said, I could hear Mrs. Bush, Laura, in the background, and he said, okay. He said, Laura wants to know, do you have any good New Year's resolutions? And I said, well, the campaign sort of took all my time, and I've gotten out of, I'm a big reader. I've always been a big reader, but I'd sort of been occupied for 2004 and 2003. And I said, I want to get back in the habit of reading. And so my goal is to read a book a week in 2005, 52 books in 2005. And he's sort of like, oh, yeah, right, nerd Nick, So a couple of days later, he arrived back in Washington, and we're in a meeting in the Oval Office, and he looks at me, looks over his glasses and said, I'm on my second book, where are you? And what had happened is he was reading Doris Kuhn Goodwin's Team of Rivals, and had finished it like on the 1st or 2nd of January. And so he was on to his second book. So I took that as a challenge. and so off we went to the races. Very quickly, it deteriorated to childish levels. And his assistant, who was in charge of keeping the list of completed books, basically said, stop talking to me and asking where the competition stands. I will put out a card every week showing what each of you have read. Only tell me when you finished a book, and stop bothering me. And so literally every week she would put out a card showing the relative level of the two of us. We quickly agreed that we had to have, it was like arms limitation agreements. Both of us are fans. I don't read much fiction. He doesn't read much fiction, but we like the novels by a guy named MacDonald, who writes these novels about 1950s and 1960s Florida, and the hero of it is a seedy private detective. So we agreed they were like cotton candy. So we could only read them if we agreed that the other would read one too. We couldn't just sort of, he wrote like 35 of these books. So anyway, we agreed on that. So the competition is going on, and the president is like really, happy with himself because he is slightly ahead of me. So what I did is I pulled ahead of him at one moment, and books are different sizes. So what I did is I calculated, how many pages and what was the size of the book, so we could have total linear feet read. And so I figured out where we were in this basic competition, and we were sitting in the Oval and waiting for some people to show up for a meeting. And he was rumbling on about how he was briefly ahead of me, I guess, at this point. And I said, well, you probably be further ahead, or maybe he was behind. And I said, you'd be ahead if we took it. You're reading big books. And if we took into account the size of the book and the number of pages, you probably are way ahead of me. He says, well, that's a good idea. We ought to look into that. I said, I have, and I'm ahead, and pulled out the card. So we literally measured by total linear feet. But anyway, we also agreed.
Equally, Karl, sorry, it's worth pointing out that he was the leader of the free world, and you were
that was his excuse.
Chief of staff. Well, it's not a bad one. It's not a bad one.
You're taking a side. Mark Roberts, you're taking a side here on behalf of the President of the United States. But yeah, that was his argument. But anyway, it was good nature. We also agreed that we would we would each read Shakespeare plays. So we would read every couple of months we'd pick out a Shakespeare play and read it. But at the end of the year, I was ahead, and I got the trophy, which looks suspiciously like a bowling trophy. And we did it for 2000, that was 2005. And I was the winner as well in 2006 and 2007. So, and at that point we retired the I still have.
It's obviously a very good thing to know that the leader of the free world is reading a lot and reading history. When and where would you say a sense of history in the past informed his decision making and the administration's decision making?
Well, he was a history major at Yale. I mean, he is, as long as I've known him, he has been reading biography and history and wide ranging. And at the White House, we had great historians come in to give talks to the White House staff and to visit with him. David McCullough came several times. Stephen Ambrose, the now departed World War II historian, came. Ron White, who wrote some terrific books on Abraham Lincoln, came. So we had a steady parade because the president, basically, his attitude was, history doesn't repeat itself, but history will inform our thinking. And so there were a constant stream of both presidential historians and American historians and world historians who came in. John Lewis Gaddis, the great historian of the Cold War, who actually was one of Bush's instructors at Yale, came to the White House as well. So, your former Churchill colleague, now departed, Sir Martin, came to the White House and gave talks as well.
How do you think George W. Bush's presidency is going to be seen by historians in the future?
Well, my view is people will look back at him and say, here was a reform-minded person who changed his country, changed his party. But he was an education reformer. He proposed a comprehensive immigration reform that will ultimately be adopted. He was bold enough to talk about how we could save Social Security and Medicare, and provided an enormous reform to Medicare that is a model for how we ought to proceed with entitlements by empowering the patient in the case of Medicare and the senior in the case of Medicare. But it will be dominated, obviously, by the war on terror. It was not something he sought. It came on a very clear September morning. But he was a war leader who kept America safe for 7 years and put in place the institutions and the modernization of our military that served the country well, not only in his time, but the presidents since then. And people would come in and discuss, how are you going to be reviewed? How are you, history's going to look at you this, or what about that? But he has a serenity about it that history will ultimately get it right, and he'll be dead, as he would facetiously say. And I think that's a healthy attitude for a leader to have.
It so is, and it's fairly rare for leaders to have that kind of attitude. A lot of them, especially towards the end of their time in office, start to become sort of rather obsessed with the way that history is going to treat them, and that can be a weakness, can't it?
It can. It diverts attention, and it's an expression of ego. And if there's one thing that the Bushes tend not to have, both the 41 and 43 and all the members of the family, it is a sense of humility. And he's right. I mean, history will be written by people who, some of whom were around for these events, and others who will study the record. And it's only when passions cool and people can stand back that the ultimate judgment of history is made.
And the passions really were red hot, weren't they? What you went through and your family, what obviously President Bush went through, the sheer personal viciousness of it all. In retrospect, do you feel bitter about being deliberately misunderstood, or do you just see that as part and parcel of the political process?
That's part and parcel. And I mean, you can't be diverted. I mean, you have to stay focused, and particularly in the dangerous times in which we were, you couldn't spend a lot of time and energy on these side issues. Self-preservation is achieved by doing the job that you're sent there to do, not by trying to manipulate the coverage or set the record straight in the midst of the activities that went forward.
And you were there at the sort of beginning of social media, weren't you? I mean, now it's even more aggressive. It strikes me sometimes. And I mean, what effect do you think that that had, social media in particular, on U.S. politics since your days in the White House?
I think it has made politics more coarse, more nasty, more brutal, more vicious, and has empowered extremists, both ideological extremists and people who just believe in extreme language and extreme action. And it's distorted our politics. The people who occupy the Twitterverse are not the American people. And the opinions expressed on the Twitterverse, are oftentimes diametrically opposed to the opinions held by the vast majority of the American people. People say and do things on the internet that they would never consider doing if they were in the same room with another human being. And to the degree that we pay attention to it, it's distorting. And the ability for bad actors, both domestic and international, to manipulate the system to their advantage, to use it as a conduit to spread poison and to enable domestic bad actors to go after each other is enormous, and we got to be careful about that.
And it does have real life consequences, doesn't it? As we saw on the 6th of January, for example.
Yeah, we did. And there's so much about the internet and about social media that is so useful. I mean, it's allowed us to, share pictures of our family and experiences with our family and friends with a click of a button. It's allowed us to get news instantaneously on our mobile. It's made it easier to organize campaigns. It's made it easier to raise money for charitable causes that are worthy. It's tied us together as a people. It's brought the vivid, experiences of what other people are undergoing. And many of those are admirable and good things, but it has also brought out an ugliness in our public square that's going to be difficult to wash out.
There are two questions that I ask all of my guests. The first one is, what are you reading now?
I make the mistake of juggling books. So I'm reading two books right now. I'm in the last two chapters of Roger Lowenstein's Ways and Means, which is about how important the finances of the North and the South were in their respective war efforts. And it's particularly focused on how did Lincoln and his cabinet, particularly Chase, the Treasury Secretary, financed the war. And it really is eye-opening as to how the fortunes of these two great powers, North and South, were dependent ultimately upon their ability to finance the war, and really terrifically done. And then I'm in the middle of Antony Beevor's Russia Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 1921, which is, jaw-dropping. The scope of the violence on both sides, on all sides, there are multiple sides in this affair, and the extraordinary actions of human beings in this period it's fantastic.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's one of Anthony's best books, and he's written an awful lot of very good ones. The second question I ask my guests is, have you got any favorite counterfactual? Is there a what-if moment of history that fascinates you, that your sort of mind goes back to?
Well, look, there are lots of them, but one of them I've been thinking about with regard, I've thought about it before, but Anthony's book has sort of raised it, which is, what would have happened in April of 1917 if the Germans had said, no, we're not going to allow Vladimir Lenin to pass through Germany in order to catch the boat to Sweden and then the train to the Finland station in Petersburg. And the revolution had already started, so you can't say, oh well, the Russian Revolution would never have happened and communism would. Maybe Trotsky would have led the effort, but the provisional, maybe Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, would have been able to make a transition to a to a Republican form, more democratic form of government. Maybe the Tsar would have been, who had abdicated, would have been reinstituted. But it is one of those moments where you realize that this really, the Russian Revolution in the form that we saw it, and the brutality of the period of the 1917 through, the end of World War II, that this came about because of one man, Vladimir Lenin, and being in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the wrong time, a better way of looking at it, and then being succeeded by his ally Stalin, and two bloodthirsty dictators who ruled over Russia. There would have been a different outcome. It's just interesting to think about all the different ways it could have gone.
It's amazing that you should have chosen that moment, because Condi chose it
Oh
for
my
my
God.
podcast the other day, and
No,
also
no.
back sometime, I can't remember when, in the 1990s, I actually wrote a what if essay on that, which I published in a book called What Might Have Been. So I'm going to have to send you a
Oh
copy
my
of that.
God.
I've got one for you.
Connie's an expert on that, so.
Well, no, absolutely, yes, clearly. I've got one for you, although I can't pronounce his surname. I'm saying Joglotz, the person who shot McKinley in September 1901 and assassinated him. Leon, how do you pronounce it?
I've heard several different ones, but I'd say Glockless.
Glockless. What if
Yeah.
if the gun had jammed, or he'd missed, or whatever? I mean, in a sense, you mentioned this earlier. You think that there's a chance that we'd have never have really heard of Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, we heard of Roosevelt because McKinley made him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So he's in a position where the Secretary of Navy is out of town. So he sends the famous telegram to Dewey, the head of the Pacific Squadron, saying, load coal, make steam for Manila if war is declared with Spain and the Spanish fleet attempts to flee, destroy them. He then resigns from the sub-cabinet in order to organize the first volunteers, the Rough Riders, and rides up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, and becomes a war hero, and returns to New York in September of 1898. And with a 30-day long campaign, he's nominated for governor, and in a 30-day long campaign wins the critical battleground state of New York and becomes its governor. So McKinley had already made him. So when he became vice president, he probably would have succeeded McKinley in 1904, when McKinley would have finished his second term.
So we still hear of Theodore from Teddy Roosevelt.
We still hear from him. But we would have had it, and frankly, Roosevelt is largely a continuation of McKinley, only on steroids and at fast pace. Because McKinley is a reformer, and not only, you mentioned protectionism. He was we'd had protective tariffs since the 1820s. But what was interesting is McKinley had decided that America's economy was strong enough that we could compete on the world stage. So he, first of all, is the first American president to appoint a trade envoy. He appoints a Kansas congressman to become the U.S. representative to try and work out trade agreements, particularly in the hemisphere, based on the principle of reciprocity. In fact, the last speech he gives, that he delivers in Buffalo at the exposition there, is a speech devoted to saying America's economy is strong enough that we ought to begin to say to other trading partners, we'll trade you the same way you treat us, which was a recognition of the maturity of the American economy. He was also, though, he was not a progressive in the sense that, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt were, but he was a reformer. That is to say, he recognized that the modern society that was emerging in America required things like, we got to do something to guarantee that food and drugs are, pure. We got to do something to ameliorate the enormous challenges facing the urban working class. So he had begun efforts, modest in nature, to make society more equal and the economy more welcoming for everyone. But he would be remembered as a president, unlike going down as he is as an assassinated president who really, all we know is that he was somewhere between all those people in the Gilded Age that we don't remember their names, and Theodore Roosevelt, the bright star who followed him.
Are you writing a book at the moment?
I am, and painfully, I'm writing. I've decided I'm writing on what happens if a president knows he doesn't know something. and he has to make a decision. And how does not knowing that he doesn't know something cause him to try and find out what it is that he doesn't know, and how does he operate? And I've settled on 3 examples: the Louisiana Purchase, who really is in charge of the 2 acres or 3 acres at the base of the Mississippi River that Thomas Jefferson wants. He's not after Louisiana. He says to his son-in-law, it's going to take us a century to fill up the space between the Atlantic and the Mississippi. They're the boundary at that point. But he is desperately concerned about the trade of the West, because everything that is grown and made and manufactured and dug out of the ground west of the Alleghenies, only one thing is valuable enough to be brought back over the mountains: bourbon. And everything else has to be put on a flatboat and floated down the Mississippi River. Spain has twice tried to steal the Western United States. And, so he wants to get New Orleans, but who's got control? Because in August of 1800, while he's running for president, there's a report in a semi-official French newspaper that Spain is going to give Louisiana back to France. And Jefferson is soured on Napoleon, but this report in the paper is denied a couple of days later by the French government. But he's worried, who's in charge? And so how does he go about finding out what he can find out about it, which is interesting? He does something that his 2 predecessors had not done. He invites the ambassadors of the 3 countries in question, England, France, and Spain, to come and have dinner with him, so he can ply them with wine and food and see if they'll tell him what's going on. The second one is the nullification crisis of 1828. Are there enough Unionists in South Carolina that if Andrew Jackson takes a tough line on the nullification of the tariff laws, that South Carolina will rally to him and stay in the Union? And then the final one is a decision that nobody remembers, but Ulysses S. Grant considered his veto of the inflation bill of 1874 to be one of the most important things he did, and it made America a global economic power, and nobody remembers it today.
Fascinating. Gosh, that's going to be a hell of a book to write. Wonderful. Have you come up with some glorious title for it?
Oh, no. First of all, my publisher won't let me ever propose a title.
I know exactly how you feel, actually, Karl.
Yeah, they're experts at that. In fact, they've said, my editor said, finish a couple of these 3 episodes, and then we'll sit down and decide on 3 more. But I think I'm going to go for 6 episodes.
Karl Rove, thank you very much indeed for coming on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you, my lord.
We'll keep that in the recording.
On the next episode of Secrets of Statecraft, I'll be speaking to Michael Gove, who's that rare thing in politics, a genuine intellectual, but also an extremely effective minister. He served in various cabinets under David Cameron, and also Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcast or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.